Good morning, everybody. Nice to see everybody again this morning. I'm really excited for the program today. I think we have a set of really interesting speakers and panels for you. So really looking forward to it, especially this morning's conversation. And also, we're very lucky to have Secretary Bernhardt with us. And so looking forward to that conversation right before lunch. So I think it'll be a fascinating day. Thank you for joining us again. It's my pleasure to kick this off by introducing Matt Lee Ashley, who's going to moderate our first panel on agency funding and staffing. Matt is the former chief of staff for Brenda Mallory of the Council on Environmental Quality. I first met Matt on a computer screen, I think, over Zoom. We were talking about the restoration of Bears Ears and Grand Staircase national monuments. And of course, that was a very interesting piece of work, and then got to meet Matt briefly in person at Camp Hale when the president showed up to celebrate the designation of our newest national monument here in Colorado. So very interesting work, and really grateful, Matt, for your opportunity to lead this discussion with us. We did have one change in the program. Unfortunately, Dr. Mamie Parker, who was going to join us, came down sick, so she couldn't make it. We wish her well, but we're very grateful for Nada Culver, who's agreed to stand in and, of course, has a lot of amazing experience. So thank you, Nada. And I will turn it over to Matt to kick us off, and I think he will be further introducing our speakers. So Matt, thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Chris, for the introduction. Also, just a big thank you both to Chris and to Annie and to the whole team that's pulled this symposium together. These are really hard events to pull off with many logistics and travel and planning and parking. So it's been an extraordinary couple days, and also, frankly, good for the soul to be among people who care about public lands and waters so deeply and are thinking so deeply about them. Just at the start, I know it's early, but a favor to ask of folks. If you have worked in government, local, state, tribal, or federal in any capacity, would you just stand up for one quick second? Yes, Nada, that includes you. Yes, Tim, that includes you. I just want to start, let's say thank you to everybody who has spent time in public service, because that's really the tenor of the panel today. It is, I think everybody who has worked in public service knows that people don't do it for the money, you do it because you care about it. And folks make huge sacrifices at all levels to serve their communities and to serve their country. And so just at the outset, that's the kind of mindset I think we want to have going into this conversation. The second thing, which is more particular to CU in the discussion over the last couple of days, is there are, in my view, some action heroes here at CU and who have traveled from around the country to be here. And for law students who are here, there are folks like Sarah Krakoff, Nada Culver's here. I saw Brett Birdsong. John Leshy is like one of the real models of this, who are legal scholars, legal experts who spend time educating in academia, but then who go into government and spend their time and effort and add their talents to solving problems. And their work often doesn't get seen or accolades, but they are the problem solvers. They're the folks who are creative lawyers who are able to get to yes, to figure out how to help government fix things and take action. And so for anybody who is in law school now and thinking about a career in public service or spending some time in public service, I think that if there's one thing you take away from the conversation this morning is that please, please, please do consider jumping into government at some point. Your work is immensely, immensely valuable. So our topic today is a live one. We are in day 24 of a government shutdown. It is also a human topic that we are talking about here. Roughly half of the civil servants who are working in at least the four big natural resource agencies, the Park Service, BLM, Forest Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service, are furloughed at the moment. They're not receiving paychecks. Many more are also working still as essential workers, but also not getting paychecks. And for those folks who are furloughed and not getting paychecks, I think this weekend is the first time they'll actually not get their first paycheck. It's a tough reality, right? Folks have mortgage payments to make, they have medical bills for family members they have to pay. And so there are those real strains that people are experiencing right now. And then already this year, we have seen an estimated 16,000 people in those 4 big natural resource agencies pushed out of their jobs in one way or another. And for those folks, that is an even greater level of uncertainty and disruption of people trying to find jobs, trying to think about whether they're going to have to move, whether they have to move their families to another place to find employment. These impacts are, I want to just at the top note, they are not simply side effects of what is going on right now, but it seems that they are a purpose of the dismantling and downsizing that is underway. The president, since his first term, has talked about the civil service in a disparaging way, talked about the deep state, calling folks who work in government crooked and, quote, dishonest. And here's a quote from the current OMB director when he was at the Heritage Foundation last year when he was working on Project 2025. Creating trauma for federal employees through cuts and downsizing is part of the mission here. I'll set aside my personal view on how reprehensible this type of statement is, but I will note that it is also deeply out of step with how the public perceives at least the natural resource management agencies. So we had a terrific presentation yesterday on the conservation in the West Pole, which over time has tracked levels of support for the federal natural resource agencies. And that support has held strong over many years. It's actually gone up in some places, maybe related to experiences in the outdoors with COVID, but natural resource agencies have strong public support, and the people that the public interfaces with are trusted, and they are loved in their communities, and they're supported. The other thing I will point out here is that even before the current, excuse me, I think I got the slides out of order here. Skip forward one here, nope. Yes. So even before this year and the downsizing that we're witnessing right now, these agencies were not flush with people. They were stretched thin to begin with. I saw a friend here who reminded me that the staffing in the National Wildlife Refuge System typically is around 2,000, a little over 2,000 people. This year it's dipped about 30% to about 1,700 people. There are actually more people working in military bands than there are staffing our national wildlife refuges. At the BLM, law enforcement is a big challenge and a big responsibility. They have about 1 law enforcement officer responsible for every 900,000 acres of public lands that the BLM manages. You think about the big buckets of work that these agencies are working on, whether it's hazardous fuels reduction or welcoming visitors or trying to permit and review development projects on public lands. Human capacity for many years has been a big constraint on the ability of the agencies to get things done. So when we start to look at where we are right now, the cuts that are happening are already happening to agencies that were under strain. This slide lays out what we know based on the information that was available in September on the staffing levels in these 4 natural resource agencies, significant reductions. More RIFs seem to be in the works. Maybe Tim can give us a little bit of a sense. But one of the things we'll try to do in the panel this morning is try to share what we know and what we don't know about the budgetary and staffing changes that are underway. We'll also talk and try to think through the near-term and long-term impacts of those changes. And then we're gonna try to deep dig into some of the questions of what's next. How do you rethink and rebuild some of these agencies? We have been very lucky to have extraordinarily talented people being willing to join the panel. I will underscore and thanks to Nada for being willing to have her arm twisted to join at the last minute of this panel. But to my left is Scott Fitzwilliams. He's very recently retired. Spent 35 years with the U.S. Forest Service, including 15 and a half years as Forest Supervisor on the White River National Forest. If you've been skiing in Colorado, if you've been to Maroon Bells, if you've been to the new Camp Hale Continental Divide National Monument, you've been to lands that Scott has overseen. He's also spent time in the Forest Service in Oregon, Alaska, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Washington, D.C. Tim Whitehouse, he's the Executive Director of PEER, the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, which is an organization focused on protecting employees who protect the environment. They defend whistleblowers, serve as a watchdog on agencies, and are providing legal support to civil servants who've been wrongfully fired or dismissed in the last few months. Before leading peer, Tim was a senior attorney at EPA and was also head of the law policy program at the North American Commission on Environmental Cooperation in Montreal. And then, of course, Nada currently co-leads Neshoba Consulting and Tribal Public Lands Alliance. In the previous administration, she was deputy director for the Bureau of Land Management and brings deep experience in natural resource, land, and policy. The final housekeeping note before I turn over to Scott, you have a Slido QR code in your materials. So for the Q&A section, if you can load up the Slido app and pump your questions in there, well, then we'll use those to feed into the discussion. So with that, thank you, Scott. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for having me. Thanks for everyone being here. As Matt said, I recently retired after 35 years with the Forest Service and got to spend the last 15 and a half on one of the great units in the entire system in Colorado here. And, I've had an amazing career, worked in, 7 states and across the country. And it took me a little while. I'd say I was probably halfway through my career till I really understood what I was working for. I just thought it was cool to work outside and they're paying me and to work in natural resources and things like that. But I realized I got to be part of one of the great experiments in democracy, this whole public land ideal, this uniquely American idea. Nowhere else in the world has a country said, we're going to set aside, in our case, 640 million acres of public land owned by everyone, managed in the public trust, for everyone. And I think about halfway through my career, I don't know if I got more philosophical, but I realized the importance of that job and what we're doing for the country and what we're doing. I really believe it's part of the strength of America is our public lands and therefore part of the strength of the democracy. So when I decided to take the fork in the road last March that Elon Musk offered, it was because I couldn't work in the environment that was being created. I just invested too much of my heart and soul, and especially on the White River the last 15 years. And so I retired officially a few weeks ago, and I have accidentally found myself in this advocacy role of speaking on behalf of public lands, and it wasn't my plan at all. But I think it's really important at this point in time, pointing to some of the numbers and stuff and just to see where this is going. I believe it's a deliberate dismantling of the federal lands and the federal land agencies and it's going to have a significant effect on all of us. And, people on the Front Range got to realize all the clean water comes from the West Slope and those national forests that need to be managed. What's going on right now, some of the data, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 employees in the Forest Service have either quit, retired, resigned, or fired. And the number you see on the screen is a little deceiving because those drop in numbers are all non-fire employees. So about half of those employees are fire employees. All they do is firefighting. So the 5,000 employees that have left in the last year or so are non-fire. Those are your biologists and your trail crews and your district rangers and it's leaving us in a situation where it's nearly impossible to manage the lands. With talking to my colleagues that are still working, obviously morale is in the toilet, but they just feel like we're not gonna be able to get anything done. And I kind of wonder if that's not the goal of the whole situation, but it's left people in a tough spot and it's going to have effects on things. One of the key things that I think is really, that's a little behind the scenes that'll take a little while to manifest itself is the loss of expertise and experience in the agency. so many of the people that left were people like myself and people had a lot of experience, a lot of expertise, a lot of biologists that worked 10, 12 years on the same unit that walked out the door. You don't replace that with just someone that walks in the door. Not that the people coming in and filling in aren't highly qualified, they are. They're just not experienced. And when you have that type of brain drain all at the same time, I think it's going to lead to some serious issues. A case in point, so in the fire world, there's full-time firefighters, and then there are all of us who support a fire when there's a wildfire. And my job was an agency administrator, so I oversaw a team that came in and oversaw the whole operations. And it takes, to get to the highest qualification level, it takes probably 6 years, 8 years to get to that point. 1/2 of the most qualified agency administrators of the Forest Service have left in the last 8 months. That's trouble when there's a bad fire situation. The person that replaced me has 0 fire experience, not 1 year. And the person that replaced my deputy supervisor, not 1 year of fire experience, when our combined experience was 60 years of working fire. So I'm really worried about the lack of expertise, the experience, and the skills that have walked out the door. Secondly, and it was so bizarre. The straw that broke the camel's back when I decided I'm taking the fork in the road is when we called it the Valentine's Day Massacre. When we were just told, we got letters in our inbox said, you need to fire these people and you need to give them these letters. And there were letters that said, you're being fired based on your performance, which was a bald-faced lie. Now, some of these people had just had performance reviews that were, exemplary or, fully successful. And, but the bizarre part about that, it was the lowest graded employees that did the work on the ground. Just field people, clean trails, clean bathrooms. And that's who they decided we needed to get rid of. So they didn't save any money. In our case, most of them were paid with fees or partner money, so they literally saved nothing. But that's the next thing I think is really serious. The level of field presence now and into the future is going to be dramatically reduced. And I think that's trouble. I mean, we were hurting for field presence to begin with, but the lack of people on the ground doing the work that everyone loves, keeping trails clean, marking timber sales, doing fields projects, those are the things that we don't have people to do it. And so that's troubling. The last thing not the last, but the last thing I'll touch on is there's to say there's budget confusion right now, obviously without a budget and a shutdown, but even within that, the agencies still plan for their upcoming year, even though it might be a CR or it might be in a shutdown, you still plan, eventually you're gonna go to work and you plan for it. And there's just a big shift in where the money's gonna go. I don't know, again, in my past 35 years I've worked, we were told you couldn't do these things. You couldn't move money that Congress has allocated for this and put it into this program. But they're doing it. And where I'm most concerned is in the vegetation management part of what we do, we're moving the work to do fuels mitigation work, to reduce wildfires like we do a lot of in Colorado, because we don't have a lot of commercially viable timber, is all that money's been moved to just support timber sales in places that grow bigger trees. The forest I used to work on right now has 0 fuels projects in the planning phase. We never had less than 3 or 4 when I was working there, because we knew it was so important to our communities. Every single community on our forest, their municipal water supply came from the forest somewhere, a stream, a reservoir, whatever. And so they're very concerned that a wildfire that we've seen in Colorado, we've seen the effects of these fires that it has on watersheds, and we're not investing in those things that we absolutely have to. And it's, again, everyone wants it. This is not a partisan issue. Wildfire mitigation has not been partisan. And so I'm really worried about the future and the future funding, about where the money's going to go. Obviously, there's never enough, but when you do have it, you need to prioritize. And given it's amazing how much has changed in 8 months. And given the future, I think it's really incumbent on all of us to make sure we stay engaged and realize that our public lands are a gift. The founders and the Teddy Roosevelts and Gifford Pinchots and John Muirs that came up with this idea, they gotta be rolling over their graves right now going, wait a minute. We put this in public trust for the good of everyone. We didn't say it was for Republicans and Democrats. We said it was from everyone. And I think the latest, the efforts by Senator Lee to try and sell off public lands that were shot down pretty hard, I think that'll continue, and that's my optimism. I think there's so much support for public lands across all sides of the aisle that eventually we're going to get through this. It's going to be a rough few years, though. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. My first assignment was to turn the slide off. So let me see. How do I do that in the show? Is that working? Kind of. All right. All right, close everything.
Just close.
I failed my first assignment. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tim Whitehouse. I'm the Executive Director of Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. And just out of curiosity, I was wondering how many people have actually heard of PEER. All right, that's many, many more than I thought. So we've come into a very different world in the last 8 months. And I wanted to explain from our perspective what we're seeing, where we think this might go, and delve into the National Park Service as an example. For us, the fork really hit the road even before people started taking the early buyout. It was with the firing of probationary employees. In the National Park Service, we were inundated with calls from employees across the country who had been terminated with no notice. Many were stuck at airports, some were stuck in rural areas. People were struggling to find out, get their termination letters and to figure out why they were terminated. And so that was a real shock, because we knew the Trump administration had a very different perspective on the federal government and how the federal government should be managed. But it was clear they were following through on Russell Vought's goal of traumatizing the federal service. And since then, it's been a steady cascade of actions and reactions against the federal service. And so one unifying theme of PEER's work is we believe that it's not possible to protect people, the environment, public lands without a competent, professional, and non-political civil service. And we also believe that there needs to be checks and balances on the executive, and that's whether it's in a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. So the types of employees that we're working with across the federal government are those who have expressed public dissent and have had retaliatory actions taken against them. Some of that's for things involving their work, but some of it is for their private speech when they're not identifying themselves as public employees or talking about issues related to their work. And that includes in the Park Service. There have been some illegal rifts, we believe, and there are many whistleblower issues throughout the public lands agencies. And we've also stepped into a new role, which is helping people get benefits. So many of these people that were illegally terminated may have been paying into the health care, but found out retroactively that the government wasn't paying for their health care benefits. So people have been stuck with very difficult situations that have been really unfortunate and really uncalled for. And that I don't think it's intentional, but I think the way some of these downsizings have happened is they weren't paying attention to the personnel issues, and they're very hard to solve. So let's talk about the Park Service. So building on Matt's slide, he mentioned there's a 32.4% reduction in NPS employees since March 2024. And so our figures show that between January 2025 and mid-July 2025, the National Park Service lost about 24% of its permanent workforce. And that's on top of 20% reductions since 2010. And as all of you know that follow Park Service, we have record visitations, and visitations the last 10 and 15 years have been steadily climbing. And so some of the documented impacts for those of you that are following the Park Service is increased public health and safety risks, project delays and cost overruns, resource damages, diminished visitor experience in some parks, and also what we're seeing is a lack of interest in Park Service jobs as a result of these cuts in the treatment of federal employees. There's a tremendous number of supervisor vacancies, although there is a hiring freeze, but there's also just mass vacancies, and many people are expressing reluctance to take jobs that will require them to move across the country where they can be terminated at will and pretty instantaneously. So we're seeing these seismic shifts occurring in the civil service, in the public land space, as well as throughout the government, and it's happening really quickly. And so our perspective is for people thinking about public lands or the National Park Service is we need to think about we're entering a new era and what role does the civil service play in these public land space. And we would encourage people that are interested in protecting public lands to think about the public employees working there. Congress at the moment has largely folded in its oversight responsibilities and is allowing the president to ignore laws, particularly on appropriations and civil service. Independent government officers, such as prosecutors, inspectors generals, commissioners, and others, are being fired contrary to the country's laws and norms. And longstanding traditions and jobs are being handed to yes men and women. The administration is also targeting people, businesses, universities, press, law firms, as well as philanthropic and nonprofit organizations. So what does all this mean and why does it matter for public lands? Well, we're rapidly moving into a system where civil servants don't have to prove their loyalty to the Constitution, but to their leader. And this is called the spoils system, and it's a system that the United States has largely tried to get rid of since the 1860s. And right now we're sort of in a lawless state because there are many cases before the Supreme Court or in the federal district courts or in the Merit System Protection Board. And so the laws are sort of in flux right now. And I do think they'll settle down in a few years, but we don't know where those laws will land, but we do know that our civil service will look very different in a few years. So what might the impacts be? So I don't really know, but I think for the National Park Service, we can expect a continued push to sell off Park Service lands. Hopefully these will continue to be met with resistance. There's widespread support for public lands, and I think we've seen that in the last 6 to 8 months. I know this cuts across party lines, it cuts across demographics, it cuts across income levels. You know, I grew up, I'd never flown, I'd never stayed in a hotel till I was in college, and that's because my parents didn't have money, and we'd go to the national parks and national forests and camp. And I think that continues throughout the country today, where the parks are a unifying force as well as the national forest. I think we can expect a greater push for development and resource extraction on or near park lands, and we can expect a greater involvement of contractors and politicization of NPS jobs. So one of the things we get asked a lot is where is all this heading with the Park Service? And one thing that hasn't been articulated is the purpose of these cuts. Are they really to make the NPS more efficient? And so we really don't know. Those haven't been clearly articulated. But I do think it does appear, for the Park Service at least, that we may be heading more toward a service model of the Park Service where there's more outsourcing of jobs, and the overall mission of the National Park Service, which is to preserve cultural heritage for the country, is less important, and there's less of a scientific bent to what the National Park Service does. So I think I'll end those remarks and take questions when they come up. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. I hope you'll all bear with me. And for the couple of people, there were at least two of you who said they were looking forward to my presentation yesterday. You know who you are. You owe Dr. Parker an apology. And I believe you manifested this. So anyway, I was asked to, since I am not currently a retired person who had been supervising folks during this administration, I'm just going to give a perspective on what I saw coming into the BLM after a much smaller scale, but not completely dissimilar experience where the BLM had been reorganized, relocated, and it resulted in a significant loss of personnel and some significant morale challenges where the BLM's headquarters was officially relocated. People left, some people came back, some people moved around, et cetera. And that process began in 2019 and pretty much ended in one form in 2021, but we did see some very similar things. So while the actual scale of that reorganization and reduction that the BLM experienced during the first Trump administration was a lot smaller than is what is currently underway, there are some similarities, I think, in what the staff experienced that may be helpful as we think about what is going to be experienced now and what we may look at in going forward in terms of, being, I guess I would summarize it as being dismissed. And by that, I mean both the actual loss of staff and that they were dismissed and this feeling that they had that their commitment to the agency and the very agency itself were being denigrated. And that perspective comes from having watched some of it on the outside, but not being in the administration as it was happening, but being an advocate, and then experiencing it coming into the next administration and having to rehire and reorganize, I guess, the BLM. So in the last previous Trump administration, there was also a claim that there was going to be some improvement, some efficiency from a reorganization and a somewhat new magical connection of the BLM to the West, even though more than 97% of BLM personnel were already out West, and most of the employees working in DC had already spent time out West before moving to DC. Most BLM employees, they start as interns, interestingly, out West, and they move all around. And then they end up in leadership positions in the states, and then they end up in DC. So those claims, kind of similar to what we're hearing now about efficiency, and as you heard, I think, from Scott, were somewhat undercut by the manner in which the reorganization and the relocations were conducted. People weren't given a lot of time to relocate, and there weren't a lot of accommodations for years of service. Many of us heard recordings that were leaked of staff being basically berated and essentially pushed out. And while supposedly the headquarters were being moved to Grand Junction, there was a lot of discussion of that. And if you lived in Colorado at the time, which I did, there was actually a lot of excitement from our governor and our delegation that, this big headquarters was going to be relocated in Grand Junction. There was actually a very small number of positions that were slotted to go to Grand Junction, and the vast majority of headquarters were distributed all across different offices of the BLM around the West. And some positions were actually just relocated as positions, not still allocated to headquarters. They were just positions that those state offices in different places in the West could do what they wanted to. So there was no guarantee that even if that individual moved out West, they would have the same job. So, it sounded like there was a plan, and it was very appealing of we're going to move headquarters out West and they will reconnect. And then when you kind of pulled it apart, there was a lot of people moving a lot of places very quickly, and they might not be those people, and they might not be moving to one place. And it sounded like it would be efficient, and it ended up being very disruptive. And so in the end, there was a significant loss of what ended up being very knowledgeable headquarters staff. Decades of experience and institutional knowledge that couldn't be easily replaced. And the other thing that happened was a reluctance of others to step into those roles because of a concern that there might be another change or a similar type of treatment of those in leadership. So that by the time we arrived in 2021, there were a lot of vacancies throughout the agency, not just in those headquarters roles. And those vacancies rippled through the function of the agency because those vacancies were in leadership positions that were supposed to help coordinate the key aspects of the BLM. And a 2021 GAO report was issued in 2021, didn't start in 2021. Those reports take a while. Found that the BLM's ability to perform its quote unquote core functions had been affected. That's not really surprising. That's what happens when you take the leadership, core leadership roles out all at once. It kind of ripples through everything. Also, unsurprisingly, I think the process of that affected the rest of BLM in terms of feeling that the administration kind of wanted them to leave and wanted in many ways to see at least parts of the agency itself just disappear. There was also a 2020 GAO report on the reorganization that concluded the BLM, quote, did not substantially address key practices for effective reforms. That's GAO speak. That gets to how they were conducting the reorganization. Again, this idea of dispersing headquarters staff around the West without guarantees of what the positions might be or where they would be. And the way this happened was the announcement happened in the fall of 2019. And in November, employees were given 30 days. So they had until December to take or not take the relocation. And then they had 90 days in March to get themselves wherever they were going. So you're talking about people who lived in DC, who had spouses, who had kids in school. This was pretty challenging. There weren't a lot of accommodations made. So, a kind of what you heard of what was the goal to that, a little bit of what you heard Scott talking about. So I think it's not totally unfair to say generating 2 unfavorable GAO reports in quick succession means there probably wasn't a lot that was going perfectly well. And it's not surprising there was a loss of both people and morale. But the other, I think, interesting thing that we saw, and that both as an outside advocate and being at the BLM, which gave me hope, was that the BLM was really committed to fulfilling its mission and was still doing a lot of good work, so that when there was an opportunity to rebuild and to engage in managing the public lands, whenever that happened along the way, people were doing that because that's why people were there. That's why they joined the BLM and joined civil service. They were doing that to the best of their ability. But there remained a huge need for experienced leadership in the career positions and for support for those in leadership, both those in place and those being hired, to be proactive, to be creative, to work together, because there's not been a lot of incentive in those last couple of years to be bold, to be visible, to take on leadership roles in the first place. People were just kind of keeping their heads down a little bit. And there was a need to help those who'd been hired to learn quickly, since many didn't have a lot of experience. As Scott mentioned, when people leave, sometimes people would step into the role, they joined in new places though, or they got jobs that were at a high level. They might not have gotten them in another administration. They might not have filled the qualifications, but there weren't others who were willing to take those jobs. So they needed help. And overall, I think we saw a need to convince people to stay. People might have still been there, but they were exhausted. They knew there was going to be more changes. We actually did some, we did polling. We asked people, we created an employee advisory group. We asked people what they thought, and the vast majority agreed that BLM needed to have a headquarters in DC. So even though they knew that and they agreed, there was a little bit of exhaustion and fear of having to move again. And they knew that people maybe valued them, but there was a concern of, what happens next? And There was a concern of people, it took a while for people to want to join the BLM again because things had been a little chaotic. But I think it was working. People were willing to rejoin. We had people who had left come back from other agencies. You know, we were, sorry, Scott, trying to get everybody back from the Forest Service. They were coming. If you looked at those numbers, you could see that, you know, the BLM was back up over 10,000 employees. They're now back down about 12%, unfortunately. So it has been going the other way. And I did just, I'm sorry, forgot to bring my phone with me for this. Sorry. All right. So I was going to leave it there, but I did just want to read this. I did ask some furloughed folks if they had anything to add. So that's mainly my perspective of, you know, it was working. I think what we're seeing is the trauma was real. The trauma will come back. There are opportunities, you know, people do perceive this. They want to get rid of us, but they also want to stay. They joined for a reason. They didn't join for the politics. They joined because they care about the land. By the time you get to a leadership position at the BLM, and I think similar to the Forest Service, you've heard it in Scott's bio, you've been all over that agency. You've been all over that land. You care about so many places that you want to stay. You are invested. If you can find a way to stay and make a difference, you will. And I was just going to read this because I think this person said it better than I can, of a perspective on what it feels like if you're one of these employees. So forgive me. This administration treats America's public lands not as a shared trust to be managed responsibly for present and future generations as the law requires, but as entries on a balance sheet. Career public servants exist to uphold those laws and ensure that decisions reflect the best interests of the American people. Yet this administration and in Congress show little regard for public engagement and the need to uphold laws. Without career employees, and meaningful public involvement, the result is predictable: privatization in the form of land sell-offs, including national park units, expanded resource extraction, and a pay-to-play system where access and permits go to the highest bidder. So that was the less optimistic viewpoint, but thanks.
All right, we have some great questions that are coming in on Slido. I'm going to kick off with a couple overarching ones for everybody. The first is, you know, thinking ahead a little bit. When we get through the phase of dismantling and there's an opportunity to rebuild, how do you attract the next generation of talent? How do you convince people to come back in and do these jobs, given the experiences they've been through now? And relatedly, from a question from the audience, what advice do you have for people right now who are starting their careers during this administration who want to enter federal public service? I don't know, Scott, you're the most recent.
Yeah, great question that I have thought a little bit about. I mean, I used to be this, you know, every young person I met that seemed to have an interest, I'd be the recruiter. He's like, you got to get into the agencies. And I certainly haven't been as enthusiastic about that of late. I think it goes back to just, we tap into the service of doing something great. I mean, you saw the poll results. You saw, we know how much public lands are important to people. It's cool work in cool places. And I think we just have to go back to that. And I think if there's a settling of, you know, the federal employment, if that becomes a little more stabilized, then I think people will come back. But I think you got to sell the missions of whether it's any of the agencies. It's incredible missions, and we in the work that is done on behalf of the American people. If you're a service-oriented person, you'll be into it. I think it's going to be problematic. I mean, I got paid fine. You know, I got paid pretty well. I mean, but I, you know, was the highest paid person on the forest, and I don't know how people did it. Like GS9s and 11s living in places like Vail and Aspen and Summit County, but they did it because they loved it. And they did it because of a pension and decent health care. And if those things get diluted too much, I think it's trouble because, you know, in the end, you got to feed your kids and do everything. So that worries me a little bit if some of those things get diluted too much. Tim, you probably have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. We encourage people to stay in the federal government, those that are sort of asking our opinion, should I stay or should I go? Obviously, it's an individual choice, but the government needs good people. The government needs people that are dedicated to the mission. And one thing about the public lands agencies and many government jobs is you just can't cycle people in and out of these jobs. These are jobs that take a long time to learn. They're not easily transferable, and you can't cycle them in and out like you can a hotel or resort or other companies. So number one is encourage people that want to go into government or stay in government to do so, to follow their dreams, follow their passions. But I agree, we haven't quite hit the bottom of where this is headed. So I think once things settle out about what the rules of the game really are, if you sign up for the federal government, we'll have to work within those rules and encourage people to get back into federal service. And just to reiterate what others have said, you know, there are some good paying jobs in the federal government, but people are in this because they're mission oriented, because they love the mission of the agencies they join, whether it's USDA, whether it's EPA, whether it's the Park Service. And that's really inspiring, I think, for me and for those of us that work in this space.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also, you know, we're seeing with ICE, you can use a lot of incentives and merits to get people on board quickly. So I think we'll need that. And then we did find with the BLM, there were a lot of retired annuitants who are willing to come back and help mentor people who are joining. And I think if we're refilling agencies and hiring new folks with new commitments who want to learn and, you know, frankly, bringing in new blood, that's great. And then there'll be some folks who want to come back. And if we're doing a merit-based hiring system and those are the right people, there should be a better way to bring those people back so it's not so unwieldy to rehire, because right now that takes a long time.
Just staying in the forward-looking frame for a minute, I have a friend here in Colorado who was a forester who described what's happening right now and compared it to a mega fire where it's burning so hot it burns even the most fire-resistant trees and seeds. And so, you know, when there's going to be a need at some point to replant and reseed. And so that's going to require a reimagining and redesigning of policies and agencies. So I'm also hoping that each of you could maybe offer one thing that you would recommend be rebuilt differently if and when there's a time and an opportunity to do so. Because, you know, no organization works perfectly. There's opportunities for improvement. What can you think of a thing that you would recommend be dramatically improved? Nada, you're smiling. You have
Well,
something.
I'm going to do two because I'm taking the privilege of being drafted at the last minute. Okay. My first one, I think for the BLM, since I assume I get to do that one, I'd like to see the true, you know, multiple use reflected in staffing and funding across the agency. Right now, there's a little bit of imbalance. The energy programs have a lot more staff, a lot more experience, a lot more funding. So, you know, if we're going to reflect the true range of multiple use and the way that users expect the public lands to support recreation and all of the other activities on public lands, I think the BLM has to staff up the conservation lands, the recreation visitor services, and that part to reflect equally with the other work that they're doing. And then reflecting the panel that we had yesterday, if we're going to build from the ground up, then there should be shared management with tribes from day one. We shouldn't be adding that on at the end. And as a, you know, oh, by the way, where do the tribes fit in? I think we could structure that from day one.
Tim, do you want?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have one answer, but I'll offer just a perspective that's a personal perspective that, you know, across the government in the public lands agencies is we need to really make sure the government enters a new era in a safe, effective way. And we're seeing artificial intelligence come into the government very rapidly. It's been around. It's not necessarily a bad thing, But as we start to use artificial intelligence in government and daily life, I think it's important, particularly in every agency, but the public lands agencies, that the public know what's happening, that they be transparent, and that we understand how these new systems are being used to manifest themselves in our day-to-day life, because they can be very helpful, but they can also be very undemocratic tools, and they are part of our future. And I have no idea how they work, but I think the next generation of people will need to know that.
The first thing would be a budgeting system that budgets implementation first and overhead last. I'm guessing in all the agencies, certainly the Forest Service, money comes from Congress, Washington office gets it, they keep what they want, sends it to a regional office. In the case of a BLM state office, they take what they want, and then it gets to the ground and that's what's left. Flip that around. We need to invest in where our investments are, and that's the ground. And I think, frankly, in the last 10, 15 years, we got away from that. It was initiatives and flavors of the month and things like that. And if you do that, the constituency, the support, the advocacy on all over the, especially in rural America where we have such a great divide right now, it'll come because they all want to see the same things. Work gets done on the ground. And then, thinking about the rebuild or whatever comes of this, I think everyone needs to think about how did we get here? A glance in the mirror. I think advocacy sometimes gets to levels and the fringes that cause people to push back. And there were a lot of initiatives that came from, different aspects of different administrations that weren't related to getting the work done on the ground. And they were just pokers. They just got everyone all wound up and really didn't have much influence. I was telling the group before we started was the National Old Growth Amendment that the Forest Service rolled out in the Biden administration. Top down, I don't know who thought of it but they weren't talking to any one of us. We didn't need it. It was unnecessary, and it caused so much consternation and so much friction and so much division. Let's leave those things alone and get back to the basics. That's what I would do if I was starting over.
We have a lot of excellent questions in Slido. A number of them are focused on trying to understand impacts that right now. Just at the top, and anybody can jump in on this, how do the staffing cuts affect the economic contributions of public lands? Any estimates on how the economics of public lands are changing?
I can start. There isn't a ton of specific data, but there was some good work done by the research a few years ago about impacts of national forests to GDP. The White River National Forest I worked on, the GDP impact was $1.6 billion per year. Thank you, ski areas primarily. Created 22,000 direct jobs and contributed somewhere in the neighborhood of $650 million in payroll from activities directly related to the White River National Forest. The outdoor recreation industry, I think, has passed $1 trillion or something. It's pushing $1 trillion. So, but I think the question is, what are some direct examples that this could be? Let me give you some examples that I've been in conversations with because they call me and say, "What do we do?" Ski areas like Vail and Copper Mountain and Aspen and Snowmass and all those resorts that were on the forest, they make huge investments. The average lift replacement is somewhere in the neighborhood of $7.5 million. A new gondola is $50 million. And so in order for those people to do projects on most of the resorts in Colorado, they have to get permission and they have to go through environmental analysis and oversight by the Forest Service. Well, people aren't doing that right now. And if you're, Vail Resorts and you're thinking of putting in a gondola or whatever, you're making a $50 million plus investment across, projects across the mountain. And you're not sure if anybody's working on the stuff, but you've got to put in an order to the lift company a year ahead of time so you can see how that'll have direct economic effects to our resorts. So that's a real poignant one that is real specific to Colorado that can affect people's jobs and the resort communities and the economics of the agency or the areas.
Want to jump in?
Well, I'll just say with the Park Service, there's a lot of good data on, how the national parks contribute both to the national economy and to the local economies. And so if you're, a park advocate, that's a very important tool for you to talk to your elected representatives to understand those benefits. I know even where I live, the C&O Canal, there are these canal towns popping up. They're very small, but as visitors come and hike and walk and bring their horses, these little towns that are very depressed, start having a new source of economic activity, and that's common throughout the U.S.
Also, a related question here on impacts. Observation that the administration itself has big plans. It has an energy dominance agenda, it has a robust deregulatory agenda. There are also a number of issues, I'll add, that a lot of work that I think everybody can agree is important. Hazardous fuels reduction, for example, transmission siting in development is important regardless of which clean energy or which energy source you're most excited about. But we're seeing, from the data that's coming in, hazardous fuels reduction, Forest Service's own data right now shows that Forest Service is well behind where they have been in recent years on work in the woods. I think it's quite hard to get transmission approved and cited without people in offices. Explore how does this administration pursue some of its own objectives with lower staffing levels? Can they do it? Where are the friction points that we're going to see?
The 3 months I spent with this administration, the one conclusion I had was there is no plan. There was no plan. They said we're going to emphasize timber production. And they made us fire our timber markers. It's like, well, how are we going to get the timber marked to get out? Listen, an administration has the authority and the prerogative to adjust the federal workforce as they see fit. And if they would have said to us, you have 6 months to do this, we're going to emphasize this in energy production. And the energy thing, and you can speak to this much better with BLM, but that's a bit of a red herring sometimes because I saw no difference in the requests for leases, oil and gas leases, or APDs, applications to drill a well, under the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. It's about the price of oil. Now we're not going to get a lot of activity at high elevation drilling when oil's $59 a barrel, something like that. So you can say you're going to drill, but drilling is going to be determined by the market, not by whether someone says, we're going to make it available. Now you can make more leasing available, like ANWR and things like that. I get that. That may not be affected by the price right now, but so it's really hard how they're going to align that. And just recently, the Secretary of Agriculture, this thing about buying cattle from Argentina that's got the cattlemen in a tizzy. The Secretary of Agriculture, our herds are way down, our cattle herds. That's part of what's driving the price of beef right now. And drought and costs and things like that are driving that. Again, the range we have lots of vacant allotments that we could make available to more local ranchers, but it takes some work, and the range budget through many administrations has been gutted to do the allotment management plans and monitoring and things like that. So there's just this disalignment of whatever. I mean, administration's got a right to have their goals and emphasis. I've been through, I don't know how many different changes in administrations that you just adjust, but there was always like an adjustment that was planned and articulated. In this case, there hasn't been, and so I don't know how they're gonna do it. I can tell you, just talking to local people, they said, we can't, even if we wanted to do that, we don't have the staff to do it, which leads me to worry about then people can wave the flag that, see, they can't get the work done, we need to privatize or whatever. Long answer, sorry.
A lot to say. A couple more agency-specific questions. Maybe, Tim, you could start with this one, but to what extent are you concerned that this administration will privatize public land management operations, including in the national parks, so operations with contracts that will be hard to undo? And I think the idea is, including like visitor service type contract.
Yeah, I mean, I think I alluded to that in my opening remarks where, when I talk to people in the Park Service and we talk to them a lot, or people who have recently left, it's like, what's the plan here? Where are we headed? What's the vision for the Park Service? And it's not really clear where they're headed, but it looks like, if I were to guess, it's more of a service industry model that's highly centralized in the secretaries at DOI with the administrative functions, and that some of the things that the Park Service does, they're already dropping some of the science and issues around resource protection. And so that does indicate that with these low staffing levels that are unsustainable, that they're going to have to hire people back if they want to protect the parks. And so the theory, I'm just guessing, is perhaps they'll hire people back and they'll have these new civil service rules so they can be fired more easily. Or they'll look to privatize the functions of the Park Service to the maximum extent possible. But some of you in the audience may know better than me, so I'm just surmising where this may head. So.
I think all the land management agencies rely heavily on contractors and partners to do a bunch of work. I think but BLM and Forest Service in particular, and Fish and Wildlife Service lean even more heavily on nonprofit partners to do conservation restoration work. So some, obviously some of that engagement of other actors and getting work done has been very positive. But are there other areas where shifting work to contractors or privatizing services gives you pause or concern across other agencies?
Yeah, to some extent. I think there just needs to be a foundation of federal employees that understand the management plans, the ecology, the science that the Rocky Mountain Youth Corps kid doesn't. On our forest on the White River, well over half of our implementation staffing and funding was from outside sources. We ran that forest with partner money and partners doing the work because we didn't get it much in appropriation. We also ran that forest at about a $30 million profit to the federal government every year. Thank you, ski area fees, primarily, and oil and gas fees and things like that. But those, whether it's Rocky Mountain Youth Corps or the Roaring Fork Conservancy, they need someone to tell them what to do and how to do it. And so if you get to the point where there's no one to do that, just a basic, at least skeleton staff that can oversee the work, make sure it's done safely, make sure it's done within confines of planning, then it's troublesome. I'm baffled. I see the same thing in the Forest Service where centralized service type model is going to be the future. This is exactly contrary to what critics of public lands, especially in the rural West, have been frustrated about. They want the local management. They want the local input. They want the local influence because it's their backyard. And I don't blame them for that at all. And to move away from that model, I think, is going to go kind of against their own constituents in a lot of ways. And I'm a little baffled at that strategy because, boy, local folks want to be, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle are on, they want to be engaged in their public lands. And if we centralize things or contract things, they won't have that engagement.
Tim, this is one I think that is specific to you. Can you talk about the extent to which there's discretion to implement RIFs when Congress has appropriated the funds? Whether the PTEs?
Yeah, whether there's discretion to implement RIFs when Congress has appropriated funds. I may have to say I'm not quite sure of that answer. If someone wants to type the answer into Sligo, that'll be very helpful. I know there are RIF processes that need to be followed, and I know there are congressional appropriations that need to be followed, and how those mesh when the administration may need to go back to Congress to notify them of RIFs. Off the top of my head, I'm not positive.
One more agency-specific one, and a couple broader forward-looking ones to end. But a couple here on the BLM. I think Nada, and maybe if you want to speculate, or I can. Why do you think we haven't yet seen a proposal to move the BLM headquarters back out west? And then based on the numbers, why does, at least at this point, it appear that BLM has had lower % reductions in staff than some of the other agencies?
Well, on the second one, I think we'll see where the BLM numbers come next. Interior, I think, has been very busy with the energy agenda. So I do think we've seen people moving around to support a lot of the energy work that has to happen to issue permits and rights of way and so forth. So I do think we've seen that. We have seen people taking the fork, the various forks, all of the silverware opportunities that exist. So that's been happening as well. And in terms of the headquarters, I think where it is now is we do have a presence in Grand Junction that includes headquarters staff. So maybe so far there is a good enough balance that reorganizing the reorganized reorganization might not be the best use of time if you're actually trying to focus on getting the work done, which is, I think, kind of the balance that we tried to achieve in the last administration, was not try to just reflexively undo everything the last administration did, because that's not always the best use of time. While it might be fun, that's not the best use of time if you're trying to actually manage the public lands.
The Forest Service is undertaking a pretty big institutional reorganization at the moment. I don't know if you have any wisdom to offer or insight there on how that's going, or.
Yeah. So the Forest Service, for those who don't know, is organized. They have a Washington office and then 9 regional offices and then the field. And the concept is to either drastically reduce the regions and the Washington office. Yesterday, there was an announcement that they still had all the 9 regional offices, and they were staffed. The person in charge of a region is called the regional forester. They were staffed with actings. They eliminated those actings yesterday, and now regional foresters are taking on multiple regions. So Troy, who's the regional forester here in Region 2, which covers Colorado, parts of Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, or Kansas and Nebraska, will also take on Region 1, which is Montana, Northern Idaho, and North Dakota. And so his scope of work just doubled or more with a third of the staff. So that's the trend. There's a reorganization team that's supposedly working on coming up with it, but I don't know where that's going to end, honestly. It's a guess.
Yeah. A couple broader questions for anybody. One is a political one. Is there any hope of engaging red district Congress people in supporting the agencies? Others can jump in. I mean, one thing I will say there is I think from what we've seen from the polling and also from engagement from Democrats and Republicans on the Hill, there is strong support from the agencies on both sides of the aisle in most of these districts. And that is manifesting in the form of, from the reporting that I've seen, there are Republican and Democratic members of Congress engaging directly with the administration to try to get some things fixed that address local problems. So there are many allies on the Hill on both sides of the aisle. And the second is just shifting out of the agency, dismantling, scaling back. There are good ideas being put forward by both Republicans and Democrats on natural resource policy. And there are some bipartisan conversations happening on some constructive things. Scott, you talked about Fix Our Forests as one thing where there's common dialogue. There's some protected area proposals. I think one on the West Slope that has been introduced by a Republican member. So anyway, just to say, like, as a starting point for answering that question, I think there does seem to be evidence of a robust conversation, maybe a growing conversation about what we do next among folks who have connections to public lands and waters. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in and add anything more.
I mean, that's been what I've seen is the conversation does seem to be pulled back a little bit. There was an original list of, we're going to close all these offices, right? And it included a huge amount of agency offices. And that does seem to have pulled back a little bit as people realized, and many of those were in Republican districts. And I take from that local districts were supported and across the aisle that, no, we do need that BLM or that Forest Service office to serve the public lands in this area.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think there's some conversations going on that are good. Oddly enough, I think Democrats in Idaho should do everything they can to keep Mike Lee in office. Senator Lee he comes up with these crazy proposals and it brings out people from both sides of the aisle. And it's like, well, keep it up because you're helping the cause. But in all seriousness, we were talking about this in the survey and polling. Conservation's an 80-20 issue in this country. I'm telling you, it's not. It's in today's world, it's about the most bipartisan thing we have going in this country. And I think it'll come around where people are going to start saying, now, who's against a trail in a bathroom that's clean and cleared? Nobody. Who's against, abundant wildlife populations and clean water? Nobody. Yeah, there's on the edges disagreements on how to manage these things, but there's great collaboration going on across the country with wildfire councils, and because communities are terrified, and it's costing them a fortune, and the damage is in the billions now. That's not a political issue. It gets into a little politics of how to do it, but at least we come to the table with a common set of agreements that, hey, this is a problem we have to address, or this is a goal we want to have. So I'm optimistic about that. I worry about how much dismantling, how long it takes to build back and the institutions and stuff like that. But I really think there's opportunities. We have great science in this arena with forestry and wildfire and those big issues. And so bringing people together, I think, is a real possibility.
I'll offer an answer to a question and ask a question at the same time. It's on here. There's a really good question here about how do you do that kind of work, Scott, in an era when there's such whiplash between administrations, right? And you mentioned the old growth proposal, and that deserves a serious postmortem, I think, and self-reflection from folks, including me, who worked on that from the other side. It was crashed and burned. And so that's the kind of thing.
Sorry about
No, that's great. It's like exactly the conversation we should have. I think for everybody who was involved in it should look back at that and say, that did not work. That was not the right idea at the right time, and it wasn't approached the right way. So that being said, that kind of the whiplash on the political side on priorities. How do you build durable policy and institutional capacity over time? And I think part of the answer to that is this project that we have ahead, which is we have to do something together to rebuild these agencies and to reimagine what the future of public lands and waters look like. And that should be a common project that a lot of different people across the political spectrum can work on. But I don't know if you have any other thoughts on how we do this work so that, in 4 years' time, in 10 years' time, we're not still, having this same fight over, whether this work is worth doing.
All right, I'll answer.
Good.
But it's not an answer, it's a thought. So, I've been largely in environmental pollution control work most of my career, and more recently in public lands. And maybe one criticism of the movement I've been part of is that we often push higher standards, more land protection, different projects that are very worthwhile, but we don't pay attention to what it might actually take to implement those ideas, and whether trying to implement an idea without a plan to implement it creates backlash. And so I've seen that happen over and over again. So I think, as the rebuilding starts, to really focus on the fundamentals and to really make sure that we have a civil service that is nonpartisan, and to make sure there's local input. And I think the public land space and what we've seen over the last 6 to 8 months is a great place to start, where there really is bipartisan support for the concept of public lands and public trust and protecting employees who work there.
Anything else to offer?
For me, it is going back to the basics of what the American public wants from their public lands. And I can speak for about my experience with the Forest Service. I think the BLM is very similar, less for the Park Service, but people want the same thing. Ranchers were always, throughout my whole career, begging me, why don't we have more range cons? More people on the ground. Why don't we have some money to do these projects? Why don't, we want more people to do trails. We want more people to do fuels projects. Loggers want more people, foresters. It's the basic work that we used to really focus on. And I think if we started there and just really focused on that basic work that everyone is pretty supportive of. We're going to have some disagreements, and when public lands were started, we knew it was a hotbed from the day Finch and Roosevelt. They have always been political from day one. But if we can focus on that, I think that ground level, grassroots support at the community level will be there. You're always going to have the fringes that don't think public lands are constitutional and all that, but if we focus on that, I think that's where I'd start. The smart people just need to like sit back a little bit, because they come up with great ideas, but it's real, as you were saying, really hard to implement, or they don't think through the implementation.
I would say, I mean, if there is a commitment to what I think, and I think I agree, is if people see themselves reflected in the way their public lands are being managed, then they're more comfortable with where the pendulum is swinging around them. It's always going to swing. I think most career staff who are these people are at BLM, at Forest Service 30, 40 years. They're used to the swing. They're not expecting everything to stay the same. And same with public lands users. Most of us are used to that to some extent. So if there is a commitment to a core amount of work where people can see themselves reflected in how their public lands are managed. So people see the range cons, people see the recreation management, people see, they also, we see energy management, but if we see everything else and we start from there, then I do think we'll be able to move beyond that to some more interesting things that when different administrations come in, they can have their pet efforts, and it will be less dramatic, and people will be able to see some consistency at the base level.
Well, first of all, thank you everybody we didn't get to all the questions, there were a lot of great questions in here, but really appreciate them. And a huge thank you to the panelists for the candid perspectives and the insights on what's happening and what we know and what we don't know. I think importantly, from several things you all talked about, I think there's the start of a conversation about what's next. And part of that is anchored in kind of this engagement and small d democracy of trying to shape the future of public lands at the local level and trying to make sure that people are empowered and their voices are having a big role. And I will underscore the appeal to people who in this room are considering spending time in public service. Do it. Don't think twice. It is valuable. It remains valuable. It'll be more valuable in the years ahead. So thank you again for joining this morning, and thanks Chris and Annie for the great organization.